I think one of the realities we face in the humanitarian world is that most of the world's poor, or the poorest of the poor, are living in fragile states. And so we will be faced with a situation where terrible destitution, the absolute levels of poverty come together with situations of violence, conflict, and natural disaster. And so there is an enormous strain on the humanitarian system to address acute need, which is at the same time very much part and parcel of this equation of poverty. One thing we need to realize as NGOs or as UN agencies is that the places we go first to ask for money increasingly account for less and less of the global GDP. And so, whereas previously OECD DAC members may have accounted for 80% of the world's GDP, it's now fallen below 50%. And so asking the same old donors to cough up money for our work requires adjustment. One of the great challenges, of course, will be the applicability of Sphere and the added resource requirements that organizations will have to find. I think that the international financial system for humanitarian action is going to need major adjustment. At the moment, we've got an ask just in the UN and with its partners of some $15 billion, and yet only about half of that is put forward. Clearly, governments are struggling at the moment to provide us the sorts of resources that are required, and they'll continue to struggle. And for the Sphere standards, I think this poses a special challenge, because the extent to which non-governmental organizations or UN agencies can apply the standards, for example in the setting of South Sudan, where I currently work, it is a challenge. Every day, for example, we have more and more displaced people who arrive at the gates of a peacekeeping mission, which only has so much space. So when we look at a Sphere standard that requires 45 square meters per person in a camp-like setting, and we only have 6, what do we do? Clearly there are many, many opportunities. We probably all need to do something that is difficult for us. When I say we, the usual cast of characters, the big non-governmental organizations and UN agencies. We suffer from something that all institutions suffer from. All of us have a couple of mantras which guide the nature of institutions. Rule number 1 is survive, and rule number 2 is grow. Now, we need to be a little bit more modest about things and recognize that actually it is with a broader range of partners, whether it's the private sector, whether it's local community-based organizations or non-governmental organizations, there are opportunities there for us to be far more innovative in the way that we work and in the partnerships that we forge. The nature of our work will continue to evolve. What I mean by that is that actually, if you look from the early 19th century up to today, the march of democracy has been relentless. The extent to which autocracies have risen and fallen precipitously has been important. And what this has meant, largely speaking, is that actually there is less violence and there is less fighting. There are certainly fewer conflicts across the globe. So on the one hand, providing humanitarian response in situations of violence is something that I think it will become more acute, but overall it will continue to decline. So what the sector will be faced with is that residual challenge in situations of violence, but at the same time an increased focus on situations where natural disasters are posing challenges, but also situations of abject poverty, and the fact that the development world I don't think has adapted quickly enough to enable NGOs in particular, or UN agencies, to engage in such situations. So you're going to have a broadening of the definition of humanitarian action.
What do you think the Sphere project should be doing in the coming years?
Well, you'll be surprised, but I think it should be doing more of the same. I think we need to remind ourselves that these are minimum standards. We should not be satisfied when we attain these standards. The key word is minimum. And I think that we need to hold ourselves to greater account and say that when we've reached these standards, we keep going. Because if we're really for dignity, if we really are for bettering the lot of people who have suffered because of violence or because of a natural disaster, well, frankly, 15 or 20 litres of water per person per day is not good enough. That's the minimum standard. So once attained, keep going. So my view on Sphere is keep going. I think that it is a wonderful project because it combines the key issues of human rights and nuts and bolts standards which people require. So there's a very good connection there between something in the UN that we're really focused on at the moment, rights up front. You know, I had a conversation recently with a group of non-governmental organizations and UN agencies even in South Sudan who were concerned that human rights and humanitarian action should not be so interlinked, because perhaps if we have human rights at the fore of what we do, it could compromise humanitarian space. I pushed back very hard on that using the Sphere project. I pushed back very hard on that using the UN Charter, where clearly human rights is who we are, what we do, and what we're all about. And so I think that if anything, the Sphere project should not consider itself less relevant today than ever before. It's more relevant than ever before, and you need to keep going.